All right. The SEC, is the SEC just a glorified Big 12? Zach, Larry, I ask you this question because to me, SEC bias is telling us that the parity in the SEC is just because it's so strong. It's just such this awesome conference that anybody can beat anybody and all this stuff. Well, guess what? The same thing happens in the Big 12. In the Big 12, the reason that happens is because there's no elite team in that conference. Is the same thing true with the SEC right now, where there's really no, I wouldn't say no elite team. Obviously, there are elite teams in the SEC. They have all kinds of recruiting and stuff like that. But there is no top dog team that's number one in the country in the SEC this season, like we are seeing in the Big Ten, where you have Oregon, you have Ohio State, you have Penn State, heck, you have Indiana, who is looking like a number one team in the nation right now. I would argue that Texas, although they just lost to Georgia, they're the only team that has looked like a number one seeded team, and they just lost this last weekend. So my question to you, Zach, we'll start with you. Is the SEC just a glorified Big 12?
All right. So we got to nuance this a little bit because if
I hate nuance, just answer the question.
Well, but
just kidding. Go ahead.
Because I think if you're asking if the SEC equals the Big 12, I would say no.
No, just glorified Big 12. Like, obviously, they're better than Big 12, but...
Yeah, and I think it's just helpful to point that out, because if you're going to sit here and say, oh, yeah, they're the same, like, they're not. Like, they're just not. They're nowhere close. But I will say this. I saw that Georgia got 2 first-place votes in the coaches poll and 2 first-place votes in the AP poll.
Which is nuts.
And I think they should have their ballots revoked immediately.
We should see who did it.
Yeah, because not only have they lost to, quite honestly, a mediocre Alabama team, but Georgia, Texas was not good. It was not good football. Like, Ohio State, Oregon was 2 excellent teams. Like, just if you go down and watch the film, they were great. Now, I will say this. Sagarin, which it's the one of the metrics I look at. You know, there's S&P Plus. Sagarin has, I believe, Texas and Georgia 2 and 3, and they have Ohio State 1 and 4. So I think from the metrics, they're fairly even. But I would still say, at least from the top end that I've seen thus far, if Oregon squared off with Georgia and Ohio State squared off with Texas today, I would pick Oregon and Ohio State. And I don't think it would be that hard to do that. Now, if you go down further, like, I think Indiana, Alabama or it'd be Indiana, Tennessee. That's an interesting matchup. I don't know who I'd pick in that. Honestly, I'd lean Indiana.
Yeah.
Penn State, Alabama, I think there's some question marks there. Fisherman just said it, and I think this is helpful. SEC middle, it's much stronger in the middle, I think, in the SEC than it is in the Big Ten. But I think anybody that's sitting here and saying, well, the SEC is just dominant. Like, guys, I don't know why Vanderbilt's ranked in the top 25. They lost to Georgia freaking State. This is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. There's no reason. And not only that, the other best teams in the SEC, LSU and Notre Dame, or LSU and Texas A&M, have lost to USC, who is obviously not very good right now, and Notre Dame, who is good but lost to a MAC team. So, like, I think anybody who's sitting there is like, well, the SEC is just so strong. Okay, then why are you getting beat by mediocre teams from other conferences?
Yeah, and why do you only play 8 conference games? Like, to me, this is something that gets so lost, is like, Vanderbilt has played 4 non-conference games, and their 4 non-conference games have been Virginia Tech, Alcorn State, Georgia State, and Ball State. They lost one of those games, and it wasn't Virginia Tech. Like, they lost to Missouri as well, which, yeah, sure, that one was a nail-biter, but Missouri also got blown out by Texas A&M, and Missouri hasn't beaten anybody good. I guess you could argue Vanderbilt's good, but this is where the SEC bias gets into effect, where it's like, oh, well, you know, Missouri's supposed to be good, and Vanderbilt beat them. Well, who does Missouri actually beat? Well, they beat Vanderbilt. And it's like, okay, but you're just going around in circles here. Like, you're just constantly going back and forth. Meanwhile, you have Wisconsin, who's 5-2, and yes, they got blown out by Alabama, but they've also blown out the past 3 teams that they've played, and they've also looked really good on defense. And so you're just looking at results here, and you're just looking at results in a conference that's not given nearly as much respect as the SEC is given, which it's wild to me. And so many SEC teams get away with these 5-2, 6-1, 5-3 records. Starting next week, these 5-3 records because they play only 8 conference games, and so you have teams like Vanderbilt playing Ball State in the middle of October. It's just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and to LFG's point, he's saying LSU's improving. I think we recognize that. Like LSU, I think LSU is probably a top 10 team right now. So I'm not trying to bag on LSU. I think it's the way that they're covered, right? So I think to your point, JR, Wisconsin, like I might pick Wisconsin to beat Alabama right now with how bad they're playing. And I certainly pick LSU to beat USC the way they're playing. But I think that's part of the point is that teams evolve and change over the course of a season. And I think it's oddly charitable to the SEC, as it always has been, to kind of assume that the SEC teams are just so much better by the end of the year. I'll just address one more comment, and then Larry, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But like someone said, Georgia had the best defensive performance that they've seen all year against Texas. Texas doesn't have a running back. And Quinn Ewers he has not been the elite quarterback we thought he was going to be. So does that mean that, I'm not trying to invalidate it, but I think we have to recognize that Texas offensively is really good in most positions. They're not elite overall. And I think the other thing I would just point out, Georgia offensively was not good. Like Carson Beck has not been very good. The receivers have not been very good.
Threw 3 interceptions against Texas.
Yeah. And so I think the issue, and maybe you're bringing this up, every SEC team, and I mean every single one of them, has a significant flaw this season. And I would argue that the top Big Ten teams have less significant flaws than the SEC teams.
One thing before Larry goes, and Larry, I do want to get your thoughts on this. I get what people are saying about LSU, like improving and looking better. But we always say this with Big Ten teams. Like, this is the part about the Big Ten that I kind of hate that we do, because we go at teams like Indiana and we say, oh, who did they beat? We go at teams like Nebraska and say, oh, who did they beat? But LSU has beaten they've beaten Nicholls State, South Carolina, UCLA, South Alabama, Ole Miss, and Arkansas. And I say, well, who did they beat? And people say, oh, well, they beat Ole Miss. Okay, Ole Miss beat Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern, and South Carolina. Like, is South Carolina really that big of a win to get both Ole Miss in the how high is Ole Miss ranked right now? To get Ole Miss, what is it, 13th or 18th, and to get LSU into the top 10? Like, is South Carolina really that big of a win? Because at the end of the day, that's the most impressive win on both these teams' resumes. And Ole Miss, at the end of the day, they are just riding off of recruiting rankings and the preseason hype of it all. I contend that if you didn't have these preseason rankings at the beginning of the season, you would have a whole lot more parity in the top 25. But because we have Ole Miss as what they start out as, like 6th ranked team in the nation at the beginning of the year, I'll look it up really fast, because they were the 5th or 6th ranked team in the nation. We look at them and we say, oh yeah, Ole Miss is a good team. When in reality, they haven't beat anybody. They haven't done anything. In the games when they were tested, they lost. LSU, they lost to USC, who right now looks like a bad team in the Big Ten, but people want to excuse that because it's like, oh, well, USC is a talented team. I don't care how talented they are. If you lose, you lose. It is what it is. So I don't know, Larry, what's your thoughts?
No, I agree. I think that, first of all, the 8 conference games I've always been harping on that, because you look at these team schedules every year and the pancakes are ridiculous. And you're right. It's like the middle of October and they're playing these teams. You're like, we were done with that like late August, early September, sweating our butts off. I remember, I mean, we're talking, I think Yes, right now the middle of the SEC may be stronger than the middle of the Big Ten because of all the variables in the Big Ten. It's hard to even get a beat on anybody, but the upper echelon of the Big Ten is certainly, I think, certainly stronger this year than the upper echelon of the SEC. And I think when you get down to the bottom, I don't think the SEC, like all of this talk as if the SEC doesn't have bottom teams too that can lose to anybody. I remember back when in the 2010s when Brett Bielema was at Arkansas. And Rutgers wasn't even particularly good. They weren't bad, but they were a middling like AAC team, I think, at the time. And beat Arkansas 2 years in a row on the road and at home. And I remember like, oh, that's the big bad SEC. Okay, it's Arkansas, but it's still supposed to be top to bottom, so intimidating. But now you're looking at the Big Ten. Almost any time, even a lower tier team plays at a conference at another Power Four, not SEC, but they're playing ACC, or even you're seeing like USC come into the Big Ten this year now and whatever. Big Ten teams win that game. Like no matter top to bottom, they're going to beat most ACC teams. Not that the SEC isn't, but I don't think the bottom of the SEC is so darn good that you can line up a top tier SEC team by saying, look who they beat, their other SEC teams, and use that as a validation of how good they are. I don't know. I think it's always been overhyped. I think it's when you look at the top tier, sometimes you have perennial powers, same as the Big Ten, and that skews things because those perennial powers are going to win a lot of national titles. Some years they're overmatching other teams, some years they're not. But when you look top to absolute bottom, I don't think the SEC necessarily stands out to me as some higher level that can't be touched top to bottom. I just don't get it. They're immortal. They put their pants on one leg at a time. They have crappy teams that are struggling every year at the bottom of the conference. I don't see anything great. And when they go toe-to-toe against the top of the old Pac-12, now the Big Ten, the top of the Big Ten, they're just as susceptible and just as evenly matched. So they're overrated, always are, always will be, because somebody pointed out ESPN has a vested interest. All these networks do, whatever. Hypes and narratives are hard to kill, and it's just going to keep going. So I'll keep hating. They'll keep doing what they do. People who don't know college football, casuals, are always telling me, the SEC, bro. And I'll always go into these diatribes and not change anything. But you guys agree with me, so we're happy.
It's true.
Oh, we're all happy.
Yeah.
I will reference this one more time, and then Zach, I'll give you the last word on. Well, not one more time. I haven't referenced this yet. Fisherman does point out, to be fair, Ohio State is top 5, with Iowa being their best win. That is totally fair, Fisherman. I would say though, Iowa is on a similar level with Arkansas in my mind. Arkansas has lost to Texas A&M and LSU. Now, granted, they did beat Tennessee, but they also lost to a bad Oklahoma State team. Iowa has lost to Ohio State, Iowa State, who are both top 10 teams, and Michigan State, who is a lower tier team. Like, there's not all that much difference between Arkansas and Iowa in my mind. Meanwhile, Arkansas received 5 votes to be in the top 25 this week after losing to LSU. They lost to LSU, got blown out 34-10, and they're getting 5 votes to be
crazy,
in the top 25.
bro.
The same amount of votes they got last week. They just got blown out 34-10 against LSU, and they get the same amount of votes. Meanwhile, Nebraska had double-digit votes last week. They get blown out by Indiana, a much better team, who, because they aren't ranked as high, and now Nebraska is getting 1 vote to be in the AP poll. Like,
Yeah.
I
think
you can't make this stuff up at this point. Like, and I don't want to pick on Fisherman here. I agree with Fisherman's take. I'm just saying, like, if you look on the other side of it, this gets a lot more clearer. The way I look at it. So I don't, like I said, I don't want to make it look like I disagree with Fisherman. Go ahead, Zach.
But I think the better comparison is actually Indiana, because I think, and I appreciate Fisherman's question, I think Ohio State does get a little bit of SEC-like treatment as long as it's not Alabama or Georgia they're going up against.
Yeah.
But I think Indiana, like, I think they're 13th in the AP poll. They're a top 10 team.
Yeah.
But if you put Alabama or Georgia or Tennessee or Ole Miss and gave them the same schedule as Indiana, and you just took away the helmet and you put any one of those teams in, and you saw all the scores and the score differential, the argument would be they're doing what good teams do. They're blowing out their competition. They're a top 5 team. I guarantee it.
Yes.
They would be top 5.
Yes.
Like, not top 15. They'd be top 5.
Yes.
And Indiana is 2 spots ahead of Alabama right now. And that's it. And people will say, well, they haven't played anybody. Nobody would be asking Alabama that.
Well, and like Joe Clapp pointed out during the game, he was like, if Ohio State or Michigan was doing this right now to Nebraska, we'd be talking about them as the best team in the nation. But because Indiana's doing it, we're like, oh wow, cute Indiana. They must be for real. And it's like, have you watched the season? They've been for real all year. John Jacobs makes a good point here. He says OSU is treated like an SEC team as it relates to being ranked. Yes, Zach, and I think he's also talking to me. I agree. Ohio State is given the benefit of the doubt a lot of the time. I do think that that's also because of recruiting rankings. I'm not necessarily arguing about Ohio State here. I could care less in this situation about Ohio State because Ohio State has their own SEC struggles. They're what, 2-7, 2-9.
It's
I don't
bad.
know. It's bad. But I'm arguing more for teams like Wisconsin, Nebraska, Iowa, Indiana right now. The fact that these teams are not being given more respect because they're not traditionally looked at as super good recruiting teams. And with the transfer portal now, it's even more difficult to look at these teams and say, well, how talented are they really? You know what I'm saying?
And I think with that, the thing that people need to understand is we're not criticizing, like, there's always been SEC bias. Someone talked about Vegas lines and how Vegas would respond. And I think people need to understand the SEC historically, at least for the past 20 years, has been the dominant conference. Like, and we're not debating that. We're debating right now. Like right now, as we are watching football, if you were to tell me, like, objectively, that you watched the Georgia-Texas game or the Georgia-Alabama game and you thought either of those games showcased that those two teams are better than Ohio State and Oregon, I don't know what you're watching. Because
you're just biased. You don't understand football if you're watching that. You say that.
There was objectively bad football in both of those football games. There were certainly bad plays in the Ohio State-Oregon game, but overall, and I'm not the only one saying this, like, you talk to different analysts who have watched the game and broken down the film, they sat and watched that game and thought, this is probably the number 1 and number 2 team in the country. But it took a loss from Texas for Oregon to be ranked number 1 this week, which is dumb, quite honestly. Because, by the way, Oregon probably has the 2 best wins of anybody in Ohio State and Boise.
Yeah. No, I agree. Thanks, Doug. JR nailed it. They don't know football. Appreciate you, Doug.